Hello, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. We've talked to you for years about financial warfare, people using markets to wage war against country to country, individual to individual. And we saw it in Greece when Goldman Sachs and their buddies decided to tear down that country and rip it for billions of dollars worth of profits. John Paulson, we got Goldman Sachs. Now it's spilling over into the crypto world, in the geopolitical world. It's happening, right?
Yes, this is a remarkable story because it's something out of sort of conspiracy theory. Normally, the mainstream media would say this is conspiracy theory. Mind you, they have not covered it since The Intercept posted this. So here's the headline. Leaked documents expose stunning plan to wage financial war on Qatar and steal the World Cup. A plan for the United Arab Emirates to wage financial war against its Gulf rival Qatar was found in the task folder of an email account belonging to UAE ambassador to the United States, Youssef Al-Otaiba, and subsequently obtained by The Intercept. The economic warfare involved an attack on Qatar's currency using bond and derivatives manipulation. The plan, laid out in a slide deck provided to The Intercept through the group Global Leaks, was aimed at tanking Qatar's economy, according to documents drawn up by a bank outlining the strategy. So we'll go through that strategy in a moment, but it's a slide deck. It's a PowerPoint sort of presentation from the Bank Haviland, which is owned by a very well-connected financier to the Tory party. And it's very interesting.
Right, so you have what we've been talking about, the ability to use derivatives and financial futures to wage war on another country. And the fact that the global economy has become financialized. We've moved beyond tangible assets as a measure of wealth. We've moved beyond borders as national boundaries. We have large money center banks, we have hedge funds, we have derivative wielding kind of rogue traders operating without accountability. They have access to $20 to $30 trillion worth of offshore money that's completely unseen, untaxed, unknown. They have access to unlimited money at 0% interest rate from the central banks. So when they find a country that they want to attack, like Qatar, they can simply go into the bond market or the stock market or the currency market, and using highly leveraged bets, they can dump $1 billion, $100 billion, $1 trillion worth of sell orders. They can destabilize that market. They can cause volatility. They can jack up interest rates. And the point being that modern warfare has jumped over the boundaries of the physical world. And just as a corollary to this, we're seeing this also in Bitcoin. There's an interloper, a rogue coin called Bitcoin Cash. And they're using the same manipulative techniques that we're seeing these states use to try and undermine Bitcoin itself, which is to be totally expected. And the financial futures contract on the CME for Bitcoin is coming very shortly. But this is not unpredictable. You have a group of rogue crypto enthusiasts who are attacking Bitcoin using a fake, what they call Bitcoin Cash, which is a fake coin.
Well, those are individuals, those are groups of investors, those are groups of hedge funds, private equity. This article mentions that private equity has done this sort of deal here. This is on a nation-state level. This is the United Arab Emirates. This was presented, a plan was presented to them by a very politically connected bank in the UK to target another nation economically and using financial manipulation and market manipulation. So it's on the first public, I mean, I think it has happened on the nation-state level before, but this is the first one that has been revealed. I'll tell you first about the bank. The outline prepared by Bank Haviland, a private Luxembourg-based bank owned by the family of controversial British financier David Rowland, laid out a scheme to drive down the value of Qatar's bonds and increase the cost of insuring them, with the ultimate goal of creating a currency crisis that would drain the country's cash reserve. Somewhere in the outline that they presented to the UAE, they said, control the yield curve, decide the future. So the plan was that the United Arab Emirates would buy credit default swaps, insurance on the bonds of Qatar crashing. They would the outline from the bank says pretend to be friendly to them, pretend publicly to the press, when you get the press to talk about this, pretend that you're concerned about Qatar and what's happening. But then the plan then calls for, so once you have the credit default swaps, then you start shorting the bonds. How do you create the illusion that there's a mass selling of bonds? By being both the buyer and the seller. So many people in the financial analyst world, so in the silver market, for example, when talking about the silver market, they said there's no such thing as manipulation because for every buyer, there's a seller. For every seller, there's a buyer. So here is what this bank, very politically connected bank, said to the UAE. The plan then calls for precipitating a run on the debt of Qatar through a series of sham transactions to drive down the price of Qatar's bonds, a manipulation technique known as painting the tape, where players swap instruments back and forth to create the false appearance of a high volume of trades. The hope is to get other traders who aren't in on the plan to see the high volume on the tape, the market ticker, and think that since volume is high in a period of political turmoil, something important must be happening, prompting them to sell. The sales, if the technique goes to plan, would drive the price of the bonds down, creating more panic and more selling according to the plan. The UAE, having bought credit default swaps against the debt, would see the value of that insurance rise as Qatari debt tanked.
Right, the wash trading, as is also known, or painting the tape, is another variation on this. And I'm just quickly mention, yes, that's exactly what we saw in Bitcoin Cash recently, a lot of wash trading to manipulate the price. But in this case, as you point out, this is a state being lobbied by a bank to commit financial terror on another state in an effort to manage the yield curve. Now, why that's important is because all countries now are in debt much more than they have any equity. And so they're not looking to, let's say, seize property, seize assets, or overthrow a government so much as they want to manipulate the yield curve, as it says right there. They want to raise the cost of borrowing to the point where the country, in this case, goes bankrupt. And they can do that by having access to virtually unlimited supply of financial derivatives products, targeting that country and forcing the yield curve to trade through market manipulation, wash trading, painting the tape, and putting the country into crisis. And this is the hallmark of our age of debt. You know, back even 50 years ago in the Middle East, people thought of that country as an oil and gas center. But that's no longer the case of Qatar, Saudi Arabia. They're not oil and gas. They're debt. They're in massive debt. They can't pay their debt. It's a debt-holding entity which happens to have a side business in energy.
Well, actually, the article points out that the problem for the plan, why it was stupid, is that Qatar does have hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars cash. So the notion, they don't have debt, they have cash. They have so much cash because there's only a population of like 10,000 people, and they have one of the largest reserves of natural gas in the world. So they have a lot of cash. The hope was that because their currency is pegged to the dollar, that it would be like that film Rollover sort of situation, which was set during the time when the US dollar was pegged to the gold, that you could cause a currency crisis. Well, they weren't able to have a currency crisis because they have so much cash that they could sustain the peg. But here, the important part to what you see going on around the world in the past few years is this third element of the plan laid out by the bank to the UAE. The third stage of the plan would be to ramp up the PR machine in order to slam Qatar internationally, pointing to its weakening financial situation, focus on the prospect of restricted access to US dollar and now doubtful stability of the country, the plan reads, and continue to increase positions. In other words, keep the market cornered and feed fears about falling prices with manufactured bad news. We covered that when the ruble crisis was happening 2 years ago, when the ruble fell like 60%, once the currency peg was pulled, once the ruble was allowed to float freely on the markets. Remember, what you saw on Newsnight, BBC, almost every single night, for night after night, was like the concern about whether or not Russia would go bankrupt. And just like this Qatar story is like the problem for that concern trolling. Yeah, it's okay to do it once, but they kept on doing it and doing it and doing it, but they never had anybody point out that, well, the problem is that they have all this cash and they don't have any foreign debts. The same with Qatar. They didn't have foreign debts. They had all this cash. So this plan was deranged. It was truly deranged. Like, it wasn't going to make any sense. But you did see in a previous incarnation, you saw the third stage that they were going to get, you know, the press to concern troll about Qatar, that you did see that when it was against Russia. You do see it with Venezuela. Venezuela, however, has a lot of foreign debt and has a currency crisis because of their they're still trying to maintain a peg.
All right, well, to your point about them having a lot of cash, that's great, but if you're using the cash to defend the currency, at some point you run out of cash. But this plan sounded like it was dead on arrival because the cash hoard versus their ability to manipulate that market to an unstable condition was incompatible with their desire to basically overthrow the country using financial weapons of mass destruction, as Warren Buffett himself called them.
There has been an economic blockade on Qatar since this plan was concocted, and that has kind of worked. The cost of insuring Qatari debt has risen some 70% since May. The stock market is down 24% this year, and yields are rising ahead of a bond offering to be made at the end of the year. Ahead of that debt sale, the country abruptly changed how it calculates how much foreign currency reserves it has. So now they're saying they have double the foreign currency reserves. So there has been some pressure on it. But again, the point is, now that this plan has been exposed, the press, obviously, you're not going to get BBC Newsnight to be able to concern troll whether or not Qatar could survive this. But it was all about getting the World Cup transferred to the UAE.
Yeah, it's all about them balls, soccer balls. Footballs. But, we pressed this for years to make the market aware of the potential for financial weapons of mass destruction and financial terrorism and coups using finance in this way. So I would like to take some credit for seeding the market with this information. Anyway, we got to go to the second half. Don't go away. Stay right there. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to return to our conversation with Max Blumenthal. He's the senior editor at Alternets, Gray Zone Project, co-host of Moderate Rebels with Ben Norton, written a bunch of books. He's an actual journalist, investigative journalist. He's on the front line. You're doing stuff. You're not just having an opinion and crying on TV like most of what we see today, including myself. Okay, so let's return to our conversation, Max Blumenthal. And first of all, okay, you identify as left, right? So what does the left, I'm so confused. What is the left about these days? What is it pushing for? What is the left-wing American political class talking about? What are their issues?
Well, it makes me want to go cry on TV when I think about it. I mean, what's defined as left is anything that is to the left of the Republican Party. And so when you talk about left media, they're talking about things like Vox or Raw Story. What I consider the left right now has really emerged as sort of an openly socialist contingency that is opposed to American empire. And that, kind of space that's been created through Bernie Sanders' candidacy has expanded massively and continues, expanding the parameters of debate and shaping the contours of discussion, but it's completely frozen out in so many ways. I mean, we've been
Okay, so you're saying American socialism. Is that, okay, that's a phrase. So talk about that a little bit. What does that mean?
Well, I mean...
Okay, Bernie Sanders obviously depicted a certain amount of this. He's a socialist, Bernie Sanders. That's his party. So that you feel embodies a left-wing ethos at this time.
Yeah, and really at this time it is an ethos. I mean, you see very little very few policy proposals or workable ways to actually enact this and implement a socialist agenda. So, I mean, it's really in an embryonic phase. You're talking about nationalizing industry. You're talking about ending corporate free trade and bringing jobs back home, putting massive public resources into, training workers and bringing health care and a universal living wage to the American public. I mean, these are basic core principles. But you see everyone from, the Party for Socialism and Liberation to Democratic Socialists for America pushing for these core policies. And they're even marching with union members and even working to some degree with, the Working Families Party and other parties that work within the Democratic Party. So you have this constellation of groups, and I think they're at an embryonic phase right now. We're in a new generation where a majority of millennials, or at least a plurality, actually supports socialism, if not outright communism. And that, is going to mean a generational shift in politics in 20 years.
Yeah, apparently this generation, millennials, are rejecting capitalism. And they are embracing what they believe is socialism. And those arguing in this case would say, well, socialism, is not doing well in some countries. Venezuela, for example, and it's having a tough time finding its footing over historically. So is there an American socialism? Is there a version of this? Because I mean, I could point to something like open source protocol free software, like a Linux, is a form of socialism. You have a collective. They're all benefiting from their contributions to the collective, and it's decentralized, and it's a bit anarchistic. But this is a form of socialism that I think is American in that regard. Does that play into this at all, in your view? The way that, even with like a Bitcoin, for example, is a distributed network protocol. It takes on the central banks. It's closer to socialism than it is to capitalism. There's more. Satoshi Nakamoto is a frickin' socialist compared to Alan Greenspan, right? Does that come into your view of things at all?
I mean, I've heard different arguments for Bitcoin. Prince Al-Walid says it's like the new Enron.
Well, we already established that he just had his wealth confiscated.
He's in jail now.
Yeah, he's in jail. So he said there's no central government, there's no central bank, and so how good could it be? And now he's facing jail and have his wealth confiscation. But is part of this socialism, this American socialism, so we're really kind of going on a tangent here, but just kind of picking your brain a little bit. There's a certain American tradition of self-reliance and anarchy, if you will, going back to Thoreau, and going back to the Walt Whitman. And, that's a very American way of thinking. And it's not hardcore, it's different form of thinking that we haven't seen represented in the daily discourse anymore. Does that factor into American socialism at all? Or your thoughts?
Let me just, clarify one thing, which is that I am not the postmodern Eugene V. Debs sitting here. I'm basically what you introduced me as, which is a journalist with a critique. I have my opinions. I'm not a socialist leader, and I'm trying to give you a sense of what I think the left is like in the U.S. When you really talk about the sympathy for socialism, if not the outright advocacy for it among young people under 35, you have to just address the situation that they've been placed in after decades and decades of deregulation, of libertarian-style economics, and they're not in a very good situation by and large. Many of them are just in deep debt for the rest of their lives. There aren't a lot of good jobs out there. They don't really see themselves driving Uber 12 hours a day as a really good option, and they're sympathetic to the kind of messaging that we heard emanate from the Bernie Sanders campaign, and that's actually even being sharpened in a more radical way by groups that are doing really impressive organizing around the country, like the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I mean, their ranks are growing, the ranks of the DSA are growing, and it's really because of the actual real-life situation that young people see in this country. And I mean, when you talk about people really getting involved in the resistance, this kind of centrist anti-Trump movement, a lot of these people have a lot of skin in the game, and they actually feel threatened because in many ways they've benefited from empire. They're doing very well living in one of the coastal cities. But the people who aren't doing that well, they're either looking for alternatives or they've totally dropped out, and that's why you see also record numbers of people simply not voting.
When you spend time battling the influences of extreme right-wing, warmongering, ultra-capitalist forces that are tearing the country, tearing the economy apart. That's obvious. Many capitalists are complaining that this system is eating itself in ways that's completely unsustainable. So you're on the front line fighting that. So how do you develop a constituency of, how do you reach out to this, like, what's the message to this millennial generation, let's call it? Like, how are they going to rally around, what point, how do they coalesce? Because it's got to be something that's appealing. It just can't be, we got to take down, unless it's just an insurrection. I mean, are we heading toward an insurrection where ultimately the social contract's completely broken, and the whole generation just stands up and says, we're just going to seize power, and we're going, and is that where we're going? Do you see seeds of that happening?
I think that's what we need to be building towards in so many ways. I think when you look at what liberal democracy has brought this country, it's brought it a system that's so easy for elites to manipulate, for banksters to manipulate. And so first of all, one of the ways to reach out to a constituency, bring people in who feel left out, we actually saw this from Trump and not Hillary Clinton, which is to have an actual incendiary critique of the system and the forces that are abusing people, whether it's Wall Street or the war makers, or the real sources of foreign influence, like Saudi Arabia and the pro-Israel lobby that are taking us to war and exacting moral injury on the heartland where most of the troops come from. The neocons, there's no critique of them coming from Washington. So that's one way to win a constituency. Trump showed that to be true. Bernie Sanders showed that to be true. And Hillary Clinton showed the pitfalls of refusing to offer a critique because it wouldn't be credible coming from someone like her who comes from that system. But what can you do in practice? You know, I've personally been involved in the BDS movement, which is a civil society movement that is operating on a global scale to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel. And it's been a very important movement in educating people about Israeli apartheid, and it's had actual effects on moving Israeli companies out of occupied territories. But there's no candidate who embraces these issues right now.
So this is the flashpoint in the Middle East for decades, is what's happening, Israel, Palestine. This is undeniably the zone, the piece of the puzzle that's, without it being unlocked, without that being solved, there can be no kind of progress whatsoever in the region. I mean, that is the key bit. It never gets solved. It never gets unlocked. And this expansion into these occupied territories is a heinous stain on Americans who don't seem to be bothered too much by it. And it causes, obviously, an incredible conflict in that area. You've been talking about this. You take a lot of heat on this topic. But it seems like things are changing. When I grew up, the storyline was very toward Israel was you kind of believed the story that we were told without it questioning it whatsoever. Benevolent force in the region for peace, and you know, on the shtetl and a commune, and everything was about Fiddler on the Roof. I played Tevye in my 6th grade production of Fiddler on the Roof. I'm an Episcopalian, but this was now in this era. There is some serious questions being asked about what's going on there. What the BDS movement is that gaining any traction, Max?
Well, I think a lot of people who grew up watching Fiddler on the Roof, who are of my generation and who went to Hebrew school or even went to yeshiva, are actually disgusted by the vision that Benjamin Netanyahu has to offer. And you see these groups like If Not Now, which are comprised mostly of students young people who went to Jewish day schools and things like that, getting involved in anti-occupation protest activity. They did a huge protest here at the annual convention of AIPAC, the main arm of the pro-Israel lobby this year.
Here's a question. Hopefully, we have time for this question. You know, you hear this narrative for decades. We're never going to forget. We're never going to forget what happened. And, you know, and looking back, historians have said,
never again to anyone but us.
How did it happen?
You know, the concept of never again is, you know, there's two different ways of looking at it. What Netanyahu offers is a segregationist narrative, never again, only to us. And, you know, then there's the universalist narrative. And you can look at it in any different, you know, set of ways and see that massive atrocities are happening to people across the world, and some of them are being carried out by those who are uttering the mantra, never again. And so it's that kind of moral hypocrisy that I've always tried to call out. And I think, you know, you're seeing a lot of the contradictions get exposed right now. The mask is lifting in so many ways. I mean, you even have Elie Wiesel, the, you know, icon of Holocaust theology, being exposed for, or at least accused of, sexual harassment as part of this flood of allegations from Harvey Weinstein. So, I mean, nobody is able to maintain their moral sheen at this point. I mean, look at what's happening in Washington these past few weeks, whether it's, you know, Manafort being indicted for $13 million of money laundering off the books, and then you have Tony Podesta leaving the Podesta group because he had the same account and he is involved in the same corruption with the Ukrainian government. He hands over the reins to the deputy director of Jeb Bush's campaign. You have this bipartisan swamp of corruption. George H.W. Bush gets accused of calling himself David Copperfield and, you know, groping women. Harvey Weinstein, the icon of liberal Hollywood, who is Hillary Clinton's big bundler, is possibly going to be prosecuted for rape. Anthony Weiner went to jail yesterday. I mean, you look at this from Brussels or Beijing of what's happening in Washington, You're looking at Sodom and Gomorrah, and meanwhile, we're preaching to the world about liberal democracy and the values of freedom. It's ridiculous. So, I mean, this is what the Trump era has really brought out, which is all of the internal contradictions of this country. The mask is off, and I think in many ways this will encourage or hasten the kind of insurrection that you mentioned. I don't know what kind of form it'll take.
No, I call it the global insurrection against banker occupation. That all these flashpoints around the world are part of that. It's an expression of that.
Giabo.
We call it Giabo. Feel free to use that in your
I'll
next
name
article.
my first son Giabo Blumenthal.
Name Giabo. Anyway, thanks for being on.
Thanks for having me.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report. With me, Max Keiser and Stacy. I'd like to thank our guest, Max Blumenthal. If you want to reach us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.